Chapter 7 of the D'Arblay Mystery. Enlarging Thorndyke's Knowledge. "I am glad you were able to come," said Thorndyke, as we took our places at the table. "Your letter was a shade ambiguous. You spoke of discussing the D'Arblay case, but I think you had something more than discussion in your mind." "You are quite right," I replied. "I had in my mind to ask if it would be possible for me to retain you, I believe that is the correct expression, to investigate the case, as the police seem to think there is nothing to go on, and if the costs would be likely to be within my means." "As to the costs," said he, "we can dismiss them. I see no reason to suppose that there would be any costs." "But your time, sir," I began. He laughed derisively. "Do you propose to pay me for indulging in my pet hobby? No, my dear fellow. It is I who should pay you for bringing a most interesting and intriguing case to my notice. So your questions are answered. I shall be delighted to look into this case, and there will be no costs unless we have to pay for some special services. If we do, I will let you know." I was about to utter a protest, but he continued. "And now, having disposed of the preliminaries, let us consider the case itself. Your very shrewd and capable inspector believes that the Scotland Yard people will take no active measures unless some new facts turn up. I have no doubt he is right, and I think they are right too. They can't spend a lot of time, which means public money, on a case in which hardly any data are available, and which holds out no promise of any result. But we mustn't forget that we are in the same boat. Our chances of success are infinitesimal. This investigation is a forlorn hope. That, I may say, is what commends it to me, but I want you to understand clearly that failure is what we have to expect." "I understand that," I answered gloomily, but nevertheless rather disappointed at this pessimistic view. There seems to be nothing whatever to go on. "Oh, it isn't so bad as that," he rejoined. "Let us just run over the data that we have. Our object is to fix the identity of the man who killed Julius D'Arblay. Let us see what we know about him. We will begin with the evidence at the inquest. From that we learned, 1. That he is a man of some education, ingenious, subtle, resourceful. This murder was planned with extraordinary ingenuity and foresight. The body was found in the pond with no telltale mark on it but an almost invisible pinprick in the back. The chances were 1,000 to 1, or more, against that tiny puncture ever being observed, and if it had not been observed, the verdict would have been found drowned or found dead, and the fact of the murder would never have been discovered. 2. We also learned that he has some knowledge of poisons. The common vulgar poisoner is reduced to flypapers, weed killer or rat poison, arsenic or strychnine. But this man selects the most suitable of all poisons for his purpose, and administers it in the most effective manner, with a hypodermic syringe. 3. We learned further that he must have had some extraordinarily strong reason for making away with D'Arblay. He made most elaborate plans. He took endless trouble. For instance, it must have been no easy matter to get possession of that quantity of aconitine, unless he were a doctor, which God forbid. That strong reason, the motive in fact, is the key of the problem. It is the murderer's one vulnerable point, for it can hardly be beyond discovery, and its discovery must be our principal objective. I nodded, not without some self-congratulation, as I recalled how I had made this very point in my talk with Miss D'Arblay. "Those," Thorndyke continued, "are the data that the inquest furnished. Now we come to those added by Inspector Follett." "I don't see that they help us at all," said I. "The ancient coin was a curious find, but it doesn't appear to tell us anything new, excepting that this man may have been a collector or a dealer. On the other hand, he may not. It doesn't seem to me that the coin has any significance." "Doesn't it really?" said Thorndyke, as he refilled my glass. "You are surely overlooking the very curious coincidence that it presents." "What coincidence is that?" I asked in some surprise. "The coincidence," he replied, "that both the murderer and the victim should be, to a certain extent, connected with a particular form of activity. Here is a man who commits a murder and who, at the time of committing it, appears to have been in possession of a coin, which is not a current coin, but a collector's piece, and behold, the murdered man is a sculptor, a man who presumably was capable of making a coin, or at least the working model. There is no evidence, I objected, that D'Arblay was capable of cutting a die. He was not a die sinker. There was no need for him to be, Thorndyke rejoined. Formerly, the metallist who designed the coin cut the die himself. But that is not the modern practice. Nowadays, the designer makes the model, first in wax and then in plaster, on a comparatively large scale. The model of a shilling may be 3 inches or more in diameter. The actual die sinking is done by a copying machine, which produces a die of the required size by mechanical reduction. I think there could be no doubt that D'Arblay could have modeled the design for a coin on the usual scale, say 3 or 4 inches in diameter. Yes, I agreed, he certainly could, for I have seen some of his small relief work, some little plaquettes, not more than 2 inches long and most delicately and beautifully modeled. But still, I don't see the connection, otherwise than as a rather odd coincidence. There may be nothing more, said he. There may be nothing in it at all. But odd coincidences should always be noted with very special attention. Yes, I realize that, but I can't imagine what significance there could be in the coincidence. Well, said Thorndyke, let us take an imaginary case, just as an illustration. Suppose this man to have been a fraudulent dealer in antiquities, and suppose him to have obtained enlarged photographs of a medal or coin of extreme rarity and of great value, which was in some museum or private collection. Suppose him to have taken the photographs to D'Arblay and commissioned him to model from them a pair of exact replicas in hardened plaster. From those plaster models he could, with a copying machine, produce a pair of dies with which he could strike replicas in the proper metal and of the exact size, and these could be sold for large sums to judiciously chosen collectors. I don't believe D'Arblay would have accepted such a commission, I exclaimed indignantly. We may assume that he would not, if the fraudulent intent had been known to him. But it would not have been, and there is no reason why he should have refused a commission merely to make a copy. Still, I am not suggesting that anything of the kind really happened. I am simply giving you an illustration of one of the innumerable ways in which a perfectly honest sculptor might be made use of by a fraudulent dealer. In that case, his honesty would be a source of danger to him, for if a really great fraud were perpetrated by means of his work, it would clearly be to the interest of the perpetrator to get rid of him. An honest and unconscious collaborator in a crime is apt to be a dangerous witness if questions arise. I was a good deal impressed by this demonstration. Here, it seemed to me, was something very like a tangible clue. But at this point, Thorndyke again applied a cold douche. Still, he said, we are only dealing with generalities, and rather speculative ones. Our assumptions are subject to all sorts of qualifications. It is possible, for instance, though very improbable, that D'Arblay may have been murdered in error by a perfect stranger, that he may have walked into an ambush prepared for someone else. Again, the coin may not have belonged to the murderer at all, though that is also most improbable. But there are numerous possibilities of error, and we can eliminate them only by following up each suggested clue and seeking verification or disproof. Every new fact that we learn is a multiple gain. For as money makes money, so knowledge begets knowledge. That is very true, I answered dejectedly, for it sounded rather like a platitude, but I don't see any means of following up any of these clues. We are going to follow up one of them after lunch if you have time, said he. As he spoke, he took from the table drawer a paper packet in a jeweler's leather case. This, he said, handing me the packet, contains your sealing wax molds. You had better take care of them and keep the box with the mark side up to prevent the wax from warping. Here are a pair of casts in hardened plaster, fictile ivory as it is called, which my assistant Polton has made. He opened the case and passed it to me, when I saw that it was lined with purple velvet and contained what looked like 2 old ivory replicas of the mysterious coin. Mr. Polton is quite an artist, I said, regarding them admiringly. But what are you going to do with these? I had intended to take them round to the British Museum and show them to the keeper of the coins and medals, or one of his colleagues. but I think I will just ask a few questions and hear what he says before I produce the casts. Have you time to come round with me?" "I shall make time. But what do you want to know about the coin?" "It is just a matter of verification," he replied. "My books on the British coinage describe the Charles II guinea as having a tiny elephant under the bust on the obverse, to show that the gold from which it was minted came from the Guinea coast." "Yes," said I. "Well, there is a little elephant under the bust in this coin." "True," he replied, "but this elephant has a castle on his back, and would ordinarily be described as an elephant and castle, to distinguish him from the plain elephant which appeared on some coins. What I want to ascertain is whether there were two different types of guinea. The books make no mention of a second variety." "Surely they would have referred to it if there had been," said I. "So I thought," he replied, "but it is better to make sure than to think." "I suppose it is," I agreed without much conviction, though I don't see that, even if there were two varieties, that fact would have any bearing on what we want to know. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But then you can never tell what a fact will prove until you are in possession of the fact. And now, as we seem to have finished, perhaps we had better make our way to the museum." The Department of Coins and Metals is associated in my mind with an impassive-looking Chinese person in bronze who presides over the upper landing of the main staircase. In fact, we halted for a moment before him to exchange a final word. "It will probably be best," said Thorndyke, "to say nothing about this coin, or indeed about anything else. We don't want to enter into any explanations." "No," I agreed. "It is best to keep one's own counsel." And with this we entered the hall, where Thorndyke led the way to a small door and pressed the electric bell push. An attendant admitted us, and when we had signed our names in the visitor's book, he ushered us into the keeper's room. As we entered, a keen-faced, middle-aged man who was seated at a table inspected us over his spectacles, and apparently recognizing Thorndyke, rose and held out his hand. "Quite a long time since I have seen you," he remarked, after the preliminary greetings. "I wonder what your quest is this time." "It is a very simple one," said Thorndyke. "I am going to ask if you can let me look at the Charles II guinea dated 1663. "Certainly I can," was the reply, accompanied by an inquisitive glance at my friend. "It is not a rarity, you know." He crossed the room to a large cabinet, and having run his eye over the multitudinous labels, drew out a small, very shallow drawer. With this in his hand, he returned, and picking a coin out of its circular pit, held it out to Thorndyke, who took it from him, holding it delicately by the edge. He looked at it attentively for a few moments, and then silently presented the obverse for my inspection. Naturally, my eye at once sought the little elephant under the bust, and there it was, but there was no castle on its back. "Is this the only type of guinea issued at that date?" Thorndyke asked. "The only type," was the reply. "This is the first issue of the guinea." "There was no variation or alternative form?" "There was a form which had no elephant under the bust. Only those which were minted from African gold bore the elephant." "I notice that this coin has a plain elephant under the bust, but I seem to have heard of a guinea bearing this date, which had an elephant and castle under the bust. You are sure there was no such guinea?" Our official friend shook his head as he took the coin from Thorndyke and replaced it in its cell. "As sure," he replied, "as one can be of a universal negative. The elephant and castle did not appear until 1685. He picked up the drawer and was just moving away towards the cabinet when there came a sudden change in his manner. "Wait!" he exclaimed, stopping and putting down the drawer. "You are quite right. Only it was not an issue, it was a trial piece, and only a single coin was struck. I will tell you about it. There is a rather curious story hanging to that piece. This guinea, as you probably know, was struck from dies cut by John Rodier, and was one of the first coined by the mill and screw process in place of the old hammer and pile method. Now, when Rodier had finished the dies, a trial piece was struck, and in striking that piece the obverse die cracked right across, but apparently only at the last turn of the screw, for the trial piece was quite perfect. Of course, Rodier had to cut a new die, and for some reason he made a slight alteration. The first die had an elephant and castle under the bust. In the second one he changed this to a plain elephant. So your impression was so far correct, but the coin, if it still exists, is absolutely unique. It is not known, then, what became of this trial piece? Oh yes, up to a point. That is the queerest part of the story. For a time it remained in the possession of the Slingsby family. Slingsby was the master of the mint when it was struck. Then it passed through the hands of various collectors, and finally was bought by an American collector named Van Zellen. Now Van Zellen was a millionaire, and his collection was a typical millionaire's collection. It consisted entirely of things of enormous value which no ordinary man could afford, or of unique things of which nobody could possibly have a duplicate. It seems that he was a rather solitary man, and that he spent most of his evenings alone in his museum, gloating over his possessions. One morning Van Zellen was found dead in the little study attached to the museum. That was about 18 months ago. There was an empty champagne bottle on the table and a half-emptied glass, which smelt of bitter almonds, and in his pocket was an empty phial labeled hydrocyanic acid. At first it was assumed that he had committed suicide, but when later the collection was examined, it was found that a considerable part of it was missing. A clean sweep had been made of the gems, jewels, and other portable objects of value, and among other things, this unique trial guinea had vanished. Surely you remember the case? Yes, replied Thorndyke, I do now you mention it, but I never heard what was stolen. Do you happen to know what the later developments were? There were none. The identity of the murderer was never even guessed at, and not a single item of the stolen property has ever been traced. To this day the crime remains an impenetrable mystery, unless you know something about it. And again our friend cast an inquisitive glance at Thorndyke. My practice, the latter replied, does not extend to the United States. Their own very efficient investigators seem to be able to do all that is necessary. But I am very much obliged to you for having given us so much of your time, to say nothing of this extremely interesting information. I shall make note of it, for American crime occasionally has its repercussions on this side. I secretly admired the adroit way in which Thorndyke had evaded the rather pointed question without making any actual misstatement. But the motive for the evasion was not very obvious to me. I was about to put a question on the subject, but he anticipated it, for as soon as we were outside he remarked with a chuckle, "It is just as well that we didn't begin by exhibiting the casts. We could hardly have sworn our friend to secrecy, seeing that the original is undoubtedly stolen property." "But aren't you going to draw the attention of the police to the fact?" "I think not," he replied. "They have got the original, and no doubt they have a list of the stolen property. We must assume that they will make use of their knowledge, but if they don't, it may be all the better for us. The police are very discreet, but they do sometimes give the press more information than I should, and what is told to the press is told to the criminal." "And why not?" I asked. "What is the harm of his knowing?" "My dear Gray," exclaimed Thorndyke, "you surprise me. Just consider the position. This man aimed at being entirely unsuspected. That failed. But still his identity is unknown, and he is probably confident that it will never be ascertained. Then he is so far off his guard. There is no need for him to disappear or go into hiding. But let him know that he is being tracked, and he will almost certainly take fresh precautions against discovery. Probably he will slip away beyond our reach. Our aim must be to encourage him in a feeling of perfect security, and that aim commits us to the strictest secrecy. No one must know what cards we hold, or that we hold any, or even that we are taking a hand." "What about Miss D'Arblay?" I asked anxiously. "May I not tell her that you are working on her behalf?" He looked at me somewhat dubiously. "It would obviously be better not to," he said, "but that might seem a little unfriendly and unsympathetic. It would be an immense relief to her to know that you were trying to help her, and I think you could trust her to keep your secrets." "Very well," he conceded, "but warn her very thoroughly. Remember that our antagonist is hidden from us. Let us remain hidden from him, so far as our activities are concerned." "I will make her promise absolute secrecy," I agreed, and then with a slight sense of anticlimax I added, "But we don't seem to have so very much to conceal. This curious story of the stolen coin is interesting, but it doesn't appear to get us any more forward." "Doesn't it?" he asked. Now, I was just congratulating myself on the progress that we had made, on the way in which we are narrowing down the field of inquiry. Let us trace our progress. When you found the body, there was no evidence as to the cause of death, no suspicion of any agent whatever. Then came the inquest, demonstrating the cause of death and bringing into view a person of unknown identity, but having certain distinguishing characteristics. Then Follett's discovery added some further characteristics and suggested certain possible motives for the crime. But still there was no hint as to the person's identity or position in life. Now we have good evidence that he is a professional criminal of a dangerous type, that he is connected with another crime and with a quantity of easily identified stolen property. We also know that he was in America about 18 months ago, and we can easily get exact information as to dates and locality. This man is no longer a mere formless shadow. He is in a definite category of possible persons. "But," I objected, "the fact that he had the coin in his possession does not prove that he is the man who stole it." "Not by itself," Thorndyke agreed, "but taken in conjunction with the crime, it is almost conclusive. You appear to be overlooking the striking similarity of the two crimes. Each was a violent murder committed by means of poison, and in each case, the poison selected was the most suitable one for the purpose. The one, aconitine, was calculated to escape detection. The other, hydrocyanic acid, the most rapidly acting of all poisons, was calculated to produce almost instant death in a man who was probably struggling and might have raised an alarm. I think we are fairly justified in assuming that the murderer of Van Zelen was the murderer of D'Arblay. If that is so, we have two groups of circumstances to investigate, two tracks by which to follow him, and sooner or later, I feel confident we shall be able to give him a name. Then, if we have kept our own counsel, and he is unconscious of the pursuit, we shall be able to lay our hands on him. But here we are at the Foundling Hospital. It is time for each of us to get back to the routine of duty. Chapter 8. Simon Bendelow, deceased. It was near the close of my incumbency of Dr. Cornish's practice. Indeed, Cornish had returned on the previous evening, that my unsatisfactory attendance on Mr. Simon Bendelow came to an end. It had been a wearisome affair. In medical practice, perhaps even more than in most human activities, continuous effort calls for the sustenance of achievement. A patient who cannot be cured or even substantially relieved is of all patients the most depressing. Week after week I had made my fruitless visits, had watched the silent, torpid sufferer grow yet more shriveled and wasted, speculating even a little impatiently on the possible duration of his long drawn-out passage to the grave. But at last the end came. "Good morning, Mrs. Morris," I said as that grim female opened the door and surveyed me impassively. "And how is our patient today?" "He isn't our patient any longer," she replied. "He's dead." "Huh," I exclaimed. "Well, it had to be, sooner or later. Poor Mr. Bendelow. When did he die?" "Yesterday afternoon, about 5, she answered. If you had sent me a note, I could have brought the certificate. However, I can post it to you. Shall I go up and have a look at him?" "You can if you like," she replied, "but the ordinary certificate won't be enough in this case. He is going to be cremated." "Oh, indeed," said I, once more unpleasantly conscious of my inexperience. "What sort of certificate is required for cremation?" "Oh, all sorts of formalities have to be gone through," she answered. "Just come into the drawing room and I will tell you what has to be done." She preceded me along the passage, and I followed meekly, anathematizing myself for my ignorance, and my instructors for having sent me forth crammed with academic knowledge, but with the practical business of my profession all to learn. "Why are you having him cremated?" I asked, as we entered the room and shut the door. "Because it is one of the provisions of his will," she answered. "I may as well let you see it." She opened a bureau and took from it a foolscap envelope, from which she drew out a folded document. This she first unfolded and then refolded, so that its concluding clauses were visible, and laid it on the flap of the bureau. Placing her finger on it, she said, "That is the cremation clause. You had better read it." I ran my eye over the clause, which read, "I desire that my body shall be cremated, and I appoint Sarah Elizabeth Morris, the wife of the aforesaid James Morris, to be the residuary legatee and sole executrix of this my will." Then followed the attestation clause, underneath which was the shaky but characteristic signature of Simon Bendelow, and opposite this the signatures of the witnesses, Anne Dewsnap and Martha Bonington, both described as spinsters and both of a joint address which was hidden by the folding of the document. "So much for that," said Mrs. Morris, returning the will to its envelope, "and now as to the certificate. There is a special form for cremation, which has to be signed by 2 doctors, and one of them must be a hospital doctor or a consultant. So I wrote off at once to Dr. Cropper, as he knew the patient, and I have had a telegram from him this morning saying that he will be here this evening at 8 o'clock to examine the body and sign the certificate. Can you manage to meet him at that time?" "Yes," I replied. "Fortunately I can, as Dr. Cornish is back." "Very well," said she. "Then in that case you needn't go up now. You will be able to make the examination together. 8 o'clock sharp, remember." With this she reconducted me along the passage, and I had almost said ejected me, but she sped the parting guest with a business-like directness that was perhaps accounted for by their presence opposite the door of one of those grim parcels delivery vans in which undertakers distribute their wares, and from which a rough-looking coffin was at the moment being hoisted out by 2 men. The extraordinary promptitude of this proceeding so impressed me that I remarked, "They haven't been long making the coffin." "They didn't have to make it," she replied. "I ordered it a month ago. It's no use leaving things to the last moment." I turned away with somewhat mixed feelings. There was certainly a horrible efficiency about this woman. Executrix indeed. Her promptness in carrying out the provisions of the will was positively appalling. She must have written to Cropper before the breath was fairly out of poor Mr. Bendelow's body. But her forethought in the matter of the coffin fairly made my flesh creep. Dr. Cornish made no difficulty about taking over the evening consultations. In fact, he had intended to do so in any case. Accordingly, after a rather early dinner, I made my way in leisurely fashion back to Hoxton, where after all I arrived fully 10 minutes too soon. I realized my prematureness when I halted at the corner of Market Street to look at my watch, and as 10 additional minutes of Mrs. Morris's society offered no allurement, I was about to turn back and fill up the time with a short walk when my attention was arrested by a mast which had just appeared above the wall at the end of the street. With its black-painted truck and halyard blocks and its long tricolour pennant, it looked like the mast of a Dutch schoit or galliot, but I could hardly believe it possible that such a craft could make its appearance in the heart of London. All agog with curiosity, I hurried up the street and looked over the wall at the canal below. And there sure enough she was, a big Dutch sloop, broad-bosomed, massive, and medieval. Just such a craft as one may see in the pictures of old Vandervelde, painted when Charles II was king. I leaned on the low wall and watched her with delighted interest as she crawled forward slowly to her berth, bringing with her, as it seemed, a breath of the distant sea and the echo of the surf murmuring on sandy beaches. I noted appreciatively her old-world air, her antique build, her gay and spotless paint, and the muslin curtains in the little windows of her deck-house, and was in fact so absorbed in watching her that the late Simon Bendelow had passed completely out of my mind. Suddenly, however, the chiming of a clock recalled me to my present business. With a hasty glance at my watch, I tore myself away reluctantly, darted across the street, and gave a vigorous pull at the bell. Dr. Cropper had not yet arrived, but the deceased had not been entirely neglected, for when I had spent some 5 minutes staring inquisitively about the drawing-room into which Mrs. Morris had shown me, that lady returned, accompanied by 2 other ladies, whom she introduced to me somewhat informally by the names of Miss Dewsnap and Miss Bonington respectively. I recognized the names as those of the 2 witnesses to the will, and inspected them with furtive curiosity, though indeed they were quite unremarkable excepting as typical specimens of the genus elderly spinster. "Poor Mr. Bendelow," murmured Miss Dewsnap, shaking her head and causing an artificial cherry in her bonnet to waggle idiotically. How beautiful he looks in his coffin." She looked at me as if for confirmation, so that I was fain to admit that his beauty in this new setting had not yet been revealed to me. "So peaceful," she added, with another shake of her head, and Miss Bonington chimed in with the comment, "Peaceful and restful." Then they both looked at me, and I mumbled indistinctly that I had no doubt he did, the fact being that inmates of coffins are not in general much addicted to boisterous activity. "Ah," Miss Dewsnap resumed, "how little did I think when I first saw him, sitting up in bed so cheerful in that nice sunny room in the house at—" "Why not?" interrupted Mrs. Morris. "Did you think he was going to live forever?" "No, Mrs. Morris, ma'am," was the dignified reply. "I did not. No such idea ever entered my head. I know too well that we mortals are all born to be gathered in at last as the— "Sparks fly upward," murmured Miss Bonington. "As the corn is gathered in at harvest time," Miss Dewsnap continued with slight emphasis, "but not to be cast into a burning fiery furnace. When I first saw him in the other house at—" "I don't see what objection you need to have to cremation," interrupted Mrs. Morris. "It was his own choice, and a good one, too. Look at those great cemeteries. What sense is there in letting the dead occupy the space that is wanted for the living?" "Well," said Miss Dewsnap, "I may be old-fashioned, but it does seem to me that a nice quiet funeral with plenty of flowers and a proper decent grave in a churchyard is the natural end to a human life. That is what I look forward to myself." "Then you are not likely to be disappointed," said Mrs. Morris, "though I don't quite see what satisfaction you expect to get out of your own funeral." Miss Dewsnap made no reply, and an interval of dismal silence followed. Mrs. Morris was evidently impatient of Dr. Cropper's unpunctuality. I could see that she was listening intently for the sound of the bell, as she had been even while the conversation was in progress. Indeed, I had been dimly conscious all the while of a sense of tension and anxiety on her part. She had seemed to me to watch her two friends with a sort of uneasiness, and to give quite uncalled-for attention to their rather trivial utterances. At length her suspense was relieved by a loud ringing of the bell. She started up and opened the door, but she had barely crossed the threshold when she suddenly turned back and addressed me. "That will be Dr. Cropper. Perhaps you had better come out with me and meet him." It struck me as an odd suggestion, but I rose without comment and followed her along the passage to the street door, which we reached just as another loud peal of the bell sounded in the house behind us. She flung the door wide open, and a small spectacled man charged in and seized my hand, which he shook with violent cordiality. "How do you do, Mr. Morris?" he exclaimed. "So sorry to keep you waiting, but I was unfortunately detained at a consultation." Here Mrs. Morris sourly intervened to explain who I was, upon which he shook my hand again and expressed his joy at making my acquaintance. He also made polite inquiries as to the hostess's health, which she acknowledged gruffly over her shoulder as she preceded us along the passage, which was now pitch dark, and where Cropper dropped his hat and trod on it, finally bumping his head against the unseen wall in a frantic effort to recover it. When we emerged into the dimly lighted hall, I observed the two ladies peering inquisitively out of the drawing-room door, but Mrs. Morris took no notice of them, leading the way directly up the stairs to the room with which I was already familiar. It was poorly illuminated by a single gas bracket over the fireplace, but the light was enough to show us a coffin resting on 3 chairs, and beyond it the shadowy figure of a man whom I recognized as Mr. Morris. We crossed the room to the coffin, which was plainly finished with zinc fastenings, in accordance with the regulations of the cremation authorities, and had let into the top what I first took to be a pane of glass, but which turned out to be a plate of clear celluloid. When we had made our salutations to Mr. Morris, Cropper and I looked in through the celluloid window. The yellow, shrunken face of the dead man, surmounted by the skull-cap which he had always worn, looked so little changed that he might still have been in the drowsy, torpid state in which I had been accustomed to see him. He had always looked so like a dead man that the final transition was hardly noticeable. "I suppose," said Morris, "you would like to have the coffin lid taken off?" "God bless my soul, yes!" exclaimed Cropper. "What are we here for? We shall want him out of the coffin, too." "Are you proposing to make a post-mortem?" I asked, observing that Dr. Cropper had brought a good-sized handbag. It seems hardly necessary, as we both know what he died of." Cropper shook his head. "That won't do," said he. "You mustn't treat a cremation certificate as a mere formality. We have got to certify that we have verified the cause of death. Looking at a body through a window is not verifying the cause of death. We should cut a pretty figure in a court of law if any questions arose, and we had to admit that we had certified without any examination at all. But we needn't do much, you know. Just get the body out on the bed, and a single small incision will settle the nature of the growth. Then everything will be regular and in order. I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Morris," he added suavely, turning to that lady. "You must do what you think necessary," she replied indifferently. "It is no affair of mine," and with this she went out of the room and shut the door. While we had been speaking, Mr. Morris, who apparently had kept a screwdriver in readiness for the possible contingency, had been neatly extracting the zinc screws and now lifted off the coffin lid. Then the three of us raised the shriveled body, it was as light as a child's, and laid it on the bed. I left Cropper to do what he thought necessary, and while he was unpacking his instruments, I took the opportunity to have a good look at Mr. Morris, for it is a singular fact that in all the weeks of my attendance at this house, I had never come into contact with him since that first morning, when I had caught a momentary glimpse of him as he looked out over the blind through the glazed shop door. In the interval his appearance had changed considerably for the better. He was no longer a merely unshaved man, his beard had grown to a respectable length, and so far as I could judge in the uncertain light, the hairlip scar was completely concealed by his mustache. "Let me see," said Cropper, as he polished a scalpel on the palm of his hand. "When did you say Mr. Bendelow died?" "Yesterday afternoon at about 5 o'clock, replied Mr. Morris. "Did he really?" said Cropper, lifting one of the limp arms and letting it drop on the bed. "Yesterday afternoon? Now, Gray, doesn't that show how careful one should be in giving opinions as to the time that has elapsed since death? If I had been shown this body and asked how long the man had been dead, I should have said 3 or 4 days. There isn't the least trace of rigor mortis left in the other appearances, but there it is. You are never safe in giving dogmatic opinions." "No," I agreed. "I should have said he had been dead more than 24 hours, but I suppose there is a good deal of variation." "There is," he replied. "You can't apply averages to particular cases." I did not consider it necessary to take any active part in the proceedings. It was his diagnosis, and it was for him to verify it. At his request, Mr. Morris fetched a candle and held it as he was directed, and while these preparations were in progress, I looked out of the window, which commanded a partial view of the canal. The moon had now risen, and its full light fell on the white-painted hull of the Dutch sloop, which had come to rest and made fast alongside a small wharf. It was quite a pleasant picture, strangely at variance with the squalid neighborhood around. As I looked down on the little vessel, with the ruddy light glowing from the deck-house windows and casting shimmering reflections in the quiet water, the sight seemed to carry me far away from the sordid streets around into the fellowship of the breezy ocean and the faraway shores whence the little craft had sailed, and I determined, as soon as our business was finished, to seek some access to the canal and indulge myself with a quiet stroll in the moonlight along the deserted towing path. "Well, Gray," said Cropper, standing up with the scalpel and forceps in his hands, "there it is if you want to see it. Typical carcinoma. Now we can sign the certificates with a clear conscience. I'll just put in a stitch or two, and then we can put him back in his coffin. I suppose you have got the forms?" "They are downstairs," said Mr. Morris. "When we have got him back, I will show you the way down." This, however, was unnecessary, as there was only one staircase, and I was not a stranger. Accordingly, when we had replaced the body, we took our leave of Mr. Morris and departed, and glancing back as I passed out of the door, I saw him driving in the screws with the ready skill of a cabinet-maker. The filling up of the forms was a portentous business which was carried out in the drawing-room under the superintendence of Mrs. Morris, and was watched with respectful interest by the 2 spinsters. When it was finished and I had handed the registration certificate to Mrs. Morris, Cropper gathered up the forms B and C and slipped them into a long envelope on which the medical referee's address was printed. "I will post this off tonight," said he, "and you will send in Form A, Mrs. Morris, when you have filled it in." "I have sent it off already," she replied. "Good," said Dr. Cropper. Then that is all. Now I must run away. Can I put you down anywhere, Gray? Thank you, no, I replied. I thought of taking a walk along the towpath, if you can tell me how to get down to it, Mrs. Morris. I can't, she replied, but when Dr. Cropper has gone, I will run up and ask my husband. I dare say he knows. We escorted Cropper along the passage to the door, which he reached without mishap, and having seen him into his brougham, turned back to the hall where Mrs. Morris ascended the stairs, and I went into the drawing room, where the two spinsters appeared to be preparing for departure. In a couple of minutes Mrs. Morris returned, and seeing both the ladies standing, said, "You are not going yet, Miss Dewsnap. You must have some refreshment before you go. Besides, I thought you wanted to see Mr. Bendelow again." "So we should," said Miss Dewsnap. "Just a little peep to see how he looks after—" "I will take you up in a minute," interrupted Mrs. Morris, "when Dr. Gray has gone." Then addressing me, she said, "My husband says that you can get down to the towpath through that alley nearly opposite. There is a flight of steps at the end which comes right out on the path." I thanked her for the direction, and having bidden farewell to the spinsters, was once more escorted along the passage and finally launched into the outer world. Chapter 9. A Strange Misadventure. Although I had been in harness but a few weeks, it was with a pleasant sense of freedom that I turned from the door and crossed the road towards the alley. My time was practically my own, for though I was remaining with Dr. Cornish until the end of the week, he was now in charge, and my responsibilities were at an end. The alley was entered by an arched opening, so narrow that I had never suspected it of being a public thoroughfare, and I now threaded it with my shoulders almost touching the walls. Whither it finally led I have no idea, for when I reached another arched opening in the left-hand wall, and saw that this gave on a flight of stone steps, I descended the ladder and found myself on the towpath. At the foot of the steps I stood a while and looked about me. The moon was nearly full, and shone brightly on the opposite side of the canal, but the towpath was in deep shadow, being flanked by a high wall, behind which were the houses of the adjoining streets. Looking back, that is, to my left, I could just make out the bridge and the adjoining buildings, all their unlovely details blotted out by the thin night haze, which reduced them to mere flat shapes of gray. A little nearer, one or two spots of ruddy light with wavering reflections beneath them marked the cabin windows of the sloop, and her mast, rising above the gray obscurity, was clearly visible against the sky. Naturally, I turned in that direction, sauntering luxuriously and filling my pipe as I went. Doubtless by day the place was sordid enough in aspect, though it is hard to vulgarize a navigable waterway, but now in the moonlit haze the scene was almost romantic. And it was astonishingly quiet and peaceful. From above, beyond the high wall, the noises of the streets came subdued and distant, like sounds from another world, but here there was neither sound nor movement. The towpath was utterly deserted, and the only sign of human life was the glimmer of light from the sloop. It was delightfully restful. I found myself treading the gravel lightly not to disturb the grateful silence, and as I strolled along, enjoying my pipe, I let my thoughts ramble idly from one topic to another. Somewhere above me, in that rather mysterious house, Simon Bendelow was lying in his narrow bed, the wasted yellow face looking out into the darkness through that queer little celluloid window, or perhaps Miss Dewsnap and her friend were even now taking their farewell peep at him. I looked up, but of course the house was not visible from the towpath, nor was I now able to guess at its position. A little farther, and the hull of the sloop came clearly into view, and nearly opposite to it, on the towpath, I could see some kind of shed or hut against the wall, with a derrick in front of it overhanging a little quay. When I had nearly reached the shed, I passed a door in the wall, which apparently communicated with some house in one of the streets above. Then I came to the shed, a small wooden building which probably served as a lighterman's office, and I noticed that the derrick swung from one of the corner posts. But at this moment my attention was attracted by sounds of mild revelry from across the canal. Someone in the sloop's deckhouse had burst into song. I stepped out onto the little quay and stood at the edge, looking across at the homely curtained windows and wondering what the interior of the deckhouse looked like at this moment. Suddenly, my ear caught an audible creak from behind me. I was in the act of turning to see whence it came when something struck me a heavy glancing blow on the arm, crashed to the ground, and sent me flying over the edge of the quay. Fortunately, the water here was not more than 4 feet deep, and as I plunged in feet first, and I am a good swimmer, I never lost control of myself. In a moment I was standing up with my head and shoulders out of water, not particularly alarmed, though a good deal annoyed and much puzzled as to what had happened. My first care was to recover my hat, which was floating forlornly close by, and the next was to consider how I should get ashore. My left arm was numb from the blow and was evidently useless for climbing. Moreover, the face of the quay was of a smooth concrete, as was also the wall below the towpath. But I remembered having passed a pair of boat steps some 50 yards back, and decided to make for them. I had thought of hailing the sloop, but as the droning song still came from the deckhouse, it was clear that the Dutchman had heard nothing, and I did not think it worthwhile to disturb them. Accordingly, I set forth for the steps, walking with no little difficulty over the soft, muddy bottom, keeping close to the side and steadying myself with my right hand, with which I could just reach the edge of the coping. It seemed a long journey, for one cannot progress very fast over soft mud with the water up to one's armpits. But at last I reached the steps and managed to scramble up onto the towpath. There I stood for a moment or two irresolute. My first impulse was to hurry back as fast as I could and seek the Morrises' hospitality, for I was already chilled to the bone and felt as physically wretched as the proverbial cat in similar circumstances. But I was devoured by curiosity as to what had happened, and moreover I believed that I had dropped my stick on the quay. The latter consideration decided me, for it was a favorite stick, and I set out for the quay at a very different pace from that at which I had approached it the first time. The mystery was solved long before I arrived at the quay, at least it was solved in part, for the derrick which had overhung the quay now lay on the ground. Obviously it had fallen, and had missed my head only by a matter of inches. But how had it come to fall? Again, obviously the guy rope had given way. As it could not have broken, seeing that the derrick was unloaded and the rope must have been strong enough to bear the last load, I was a good deal puzzled as to how the accident could have befallen. Nor was I much less puzzled when I had made my inspection. The rope was of course unbroken, and its fall, the part below the pulley blocks, passed into the shed through a window-like hole. This I could see as I approached, and also that a door in the end of the shed nearest to me was ajar. Opening it, I plunged into the dark interior, and partly by touch and partly by the faint glimmer that came in at the window, I was able to make out the state of affairs. Just below the hole through which the rope entered was a large cleat, on which the fall must have been delayed. But the cleat was vacant, the rope hung down from the hole, and its end lay in an untidy raffle on the floor. It looked as if it had been cast off the cleat, but as there had apparently been no one in the shed, the only possible supposition was that the rope had been badly secured, that it had gradually worked loose and had at last slipped off the cleat. But it was difficult to understand how it had slipped right off. I found my stick lying at the edge of the quay and close by it my pipe. Having recovered these treasures, I set off to retrace my steps along the towpath, sped on my way by a jovial chorus from the sloop. A very few minutes brought me to the steps, which I ascended 2 at a time, and then having traversed the alley, I came out sheepishly into Market Street. To my relief, I saw a light in Mr. Morris's shop, and I could even make out a moving figure in the background. I hurried across, and opening the glazed door, entered the shop, at the back of which Mr. Morris was seated at a bench, filing some small object, which was fixed in a vise. He looked round at me with no great cordiality, but suddenly observing my condition, he dropped this vial on the bench and exclaimed, "Good Lord, Doctor! What on earth have you been doing?" "Nothing on earth," I replied with a feeble grin, "but something in the water. I've been into the canal." "But what for?" he demanded. "Oh, I didn't go in intentionally," I replied, and then I gave him a sketch of the incident, as short as I could make it, for my teeth were chattering and explanations were chilly work. However, he rose nobly to the occasion. "You'll catch your death of cold," he exclaimed, starting up. "Come in here and slip off your things at once, while I go for some blankets." He led me into a little den behind the shop, and having lighted a gas fire, went out by a back door. I lost no time in peeling off my dripping clothes, and by the time that he had returned, I was in a state in which I ought to have been when I took my plunge. "Here you are," said he. "Put on this dressing gown and wrap yourself in the blankets. We'll draw this chair up to the fire, and then you will be all right for the present." I followed his directions, pouring out my thanks as well as my chattering teeth would let me. "Oh, that's all right," said he. "If you will empty your pockets, the missus can put some of the things through the wringer, and then they'll soon dry. There happens to be a good fire in the kitchen, some advanced cooking on account of the funeral. You can dry your hat and boots here. If anyone comes to the shop, you might just press that electric bell push." When he had gone, I drew the Windsor armchair close to the fire and made myself as comfortable as I could, dividing my attention between my hat and my boots, which called for careful roasting, and the contents of the room. The latter appeared to be a sort of store for the reserve stock in trade, and certainly this was a most amazing collection. I could not see a single article for which I would have given sixpence. The array on the shelves suggested that the shop had been stocked with the sweepings of all the stalls in Market Street, with those of Shoreditch High Street thrown in. As I ran my eye along the ranks of dialless clocks, cracked fiddles, stopperless decanters, and tattered theological volumes, I found myself speculating profoundly on how Mr. Morris made a livelihood. He professed to be a dealer in antiques, and there was assuredly no question as to the antiquity of the goods in this room. But there is little pecuniary value in the kind of antiquity that is unearthed from a dust-bin. It was really rather mysterious. Mr. Morris was a somewhat superior man, and he did not appear to be poor. Yet this shop did not seem capable of yielding an income that would have been acceptable to a rag-picker. And during the whole of the time in which I sat warming myself, there was not a single visitor to the shop. However, it was no concern of mine, and I had just reached this sage conclusion when Mr. Morris returned with my clothes. "There," he said. "They are very creased and disreputable, but they are quite dry. They would have had to be cleaned and pressed in any case." With this he went out into the shop and resumed his filing, while I put on the stiff and crumpled garments. When I was dressed, I followed him and thanked him effusively for his kind offices, leaving also a grateful message for his wife. He took my thanks rather stolidly, and having wished me good night, picked up his file and fell to work again. I decided to walk home, principally I think to avoid exhibiting myself in a public vehicle. But my self-consciousness soon wore off, and when in the neighborhood of Clerkenwell I perceived Dr. Usher, on the opposite side of the street, I crossed the road and touched his arm. He looked round quickly, and recognizing me, shook hands cordially. "What are you doing in my beat at this time of night?" he asked. "You are not still at Cornish's, are you?" "Yes," I answered, "but not for long. I have just made my last visit and signed the death certificate." "Good man," said he, "very methodical. Nothing like finishing a case up neatly. They didn't invite you to their funeral, I suppose?" "No," I replied, "and I shouldn't have gone if they had." "Quite right," he agreed. "Funerals are rather outside medical practice. But you have to go sometimes. Policy, you know. I had to go to one the day before yesterday. Beastly nuisance it was. Chappie would insist on putting me down at my door in the morning coach. Meant well, of course, but it was very awkward. All the neighbors came to their shop doors and grinned as I got out. Felt an awful fool. Couldn't grin back, you see. Had to keep up the farce to the end." "I don't see that it was exactly a farce," I objected. "That is because you weren't there," he retorted. "It was the silliest exhibition you ever saw. Just think of it. The parson who ran the show had actually got a lot of school children to stand round the grave and sing a blooming hymn. Safe in the arms of, the confounded doggerel." "Well, why not?" I protested. "I dare say the friends of the deceased liked it." "No doubt," said he. "I expect they put the parson up to it. But it was sickening to hear those kids bleating that stuff. How did they know where he was? An old rip with malignant disease of the pancreas, too. Really, Usher, I exclaimed, laughing at his quaint cynicism, you are unreasonable. There are no pathological disqualifications for the better land, I hope. I suppose not, he agreed with a grin. Don't have to show a clean bill of health before they let you in. But it was a trying business, you must admit. I hate cant of that sort, and yet one had to pull a long face and join in the beastly chorus. The picture that his last words suggested was too much for my gravity. I laughed long and joyously. However, Usher was not offended. Indeed, I suspect that he appreciated the humor of the situation as much as I did. But he had trained himself to an outward solemnity of manner that was doubtless a valuable asset in his particular class of practice. And he walked at my side in unmoved gravity, taking an occasional quick critical look at me. When we came to the parting of our ways, he once more shook my hand warmly and delivered a little farewell speech. You'd never been to see me, Gray. Haven't had time, I suppose. But when you are free, you might look me up one evening to have a smoke and a glass and talk over old times. There's always a bit of grub going, you know. I promised to drop in before long, and then he added, I gave you 1 or 2 tips when I saw you last. Now I'm going to give you another. Never neglect your appearance. It's a great mistake. Treat yourself with respect, and the world will respect you. No need to be a dandy, but just keep an eye on your tailor and your laundress, especially your laundress. Clean collars don't cost much and they pay, and so does a trousers press. People expect a doctor to be well turned out. Now you mustn't think me impertinent. We are old pals and I want you to get on. So long, old chap. Look me up as soon as you can. And without giving me the opportunity to reply, he turned about and bustled off, swinging his umbrella and offering perhaps a not very impressive illustration of his own excellent precepts. But his words served as a reminder which caused me to pursue the remainder of my journey by way of side streets, neither too well lighted nor too much frequented. As I let myself in with my key and closed the street door, Cornish stepped out of the dining room. I thought you were lost, Gray, said he. Where the deuce have you been all this time? Then as I came into the light of the hall lamp, he exclaimed, And what in the name of fortune have you been up to? I have had a wedding, I explained. I'll tell you all about it presently. Dr. Thorndyke is in the dining room, said he. Came in a few minutes ago to see you. He seized me by the arm and ran me into the room, where I found Thorndyke methodically filling his pipe. He looked up as I entered and regarded me with raised eyebrows. Why, my dear fellow, you've been in the water, he exclaimed. But yet your clothes are not wet. What has been happening to you? If you can wait a few minutes, I replied, while I wash and change, I will relate my adventures. But perhaps you haven't time. I want to hear all about it, he replied, so run along and be as quick as you can. I bustled up to my room, and having washed and executed a lightning change, came down to the dining room, where I found Cornish in the act of setting out decanters and glasses. I've told Dr. Thorndyke what took you to Hoxton, said he, and he wants a full account of everything that happened. He is always suspicious of cremation cases, as you know from his lectures. Yes, I remember his warning, said I, but this was a perfectly commonplace, straightforward affair. Did you go for your swim before or after the examination? Thorndyke asked. Oh, after, I replied. Then let us hear about the examination first, said he. On this, I plunged into a detailed account of all that had befallen since my arrival at Market Street, to which Thorndyke listened, not only patiently, but with the closest attention, and even cross-examined me to elicit further details. Everything seemed to interest him, from the construction of the coffin to the contents of Mr. Morris's shop. When I had finished, Cornish remarked, Well, it is a queer affair. I don't understand that rope at all. Ropes don't uncleat themselves. They may slip, but they don't come right off the cleat. It looks more as if some mischievous fool had cast it off for a joke. But there was no one there, said I. The shed was empty when I examined it, and there was not a soul in sight on the towpath. Could you see the shed when you were in the water? Thorndyke asked. No, my head was below the level of the towpath. But if anyone had run out and made off, I must have seen him on the path when I came out. He couldn't have got out of sight in time. Besides, it is incredible that even a fool should play such a trick as that." "It is," he agreed, "but every explanation seems incredible. The only plain fact is that it happened. It is a queer business altogether, and not the least queer feature in the case is your friend Morris. Hoxton is an unlikely place for a dealer in antiques, unless he should happen to deal in other things as well. Things, I mean, of ambiguous ownership." "Just what I was thinking," said Cornish. "Sounds uncommonly like a fence. However, that is no business of ours." "No," agreed Thorndyke, rising and knocking out his pipe. "And now I must be going. Do you care to walk with me to the bottom of Doughty Street, Gray?" I assented at once, suspecting that he had something to say to me that he did not wish to say before Cornish. And so it turned out, for as soon as we were outside, he said, "What I really called about was this. It seems that we have done the police an injustice. They were more on the spot than we gave them credit for. I have learned, and this is in the strictest confidence, that they took that coin round to the British Museum for the expert's report. Then a very curious fact came to light. That coin is not the original which was stolen. It is an electrotype in gold, made in two halves very neatly soldered together and carefully worked on the milled edge to hide the join. That is extremely important in several respects. In the first place, it suggests an explanation of the otherwise incredible circumstance that it was being carried loose in the waistcoat pocket. It had probably been recently obtained from the electrotyper. That suggests the question, is it possible that D'Arblay might have been that electrotyper? Did he ever work the electrotype process? We must ascertain whether he did." "There is no need," said I. "It is known to me as a fact that he did. The little plaquettes that I took for castings are electrotypes made by himself. He worked the process quite a lot, and was very skillful in finishing. For instance, he did a small bust of his daughter in 2 parts and brazed them together." "Then you see, Gray," said Thorndyke, "that advances us considerably. We now have a plausible suggestion as to the motive and a new field of investigation. Let us suppose that this man employed D'Arblay to make electrotype copies of certain unique objects with the intention of disposing them to collectors. The originals, being stolen property, would be almost impossible to dispose of with safety, but a copy would not necessarily incriminate the owner. But when D'Arblay had made the copies, he would be a dangerous person, for he would know who had the originals. Here, to a man whom we know to be a callous murderer, would be a sufficient reason for making away with D'Arblay." "But do you think that D'Arblay would have undertaken such a decidedly fishy job? It seems hardly like him." "Why not?" demanded Thorndyke. "There was nothing suspicious about the transaction. The man who wanted the copies was the owner of the originals, and D'Arblay would not know or suspect that they were stolen." "That is true," I admitted, "but you were speaking of a new field of investigation." "Yes. If a number of copies of different objects have been made, there is a fair chance that some of them have been disposed of. If they have and can be traced, they will give us a start along a new line, which may bring us in sight of the man himself. Do you ever see Miss D'Arblay now?" "Oh, yes," I replied. "I am quite one of the family at Highgate. I have been there every Sunday lately." "Have you?" he exclaimed with a smile. "You are a pretty locum tenens. However, if you are quite at home there, you can make a few discreet inquiries. Find out, if you can, whether any electrodes had been made recently, and if so, what they were and who was the client. Will you do that?" I agreed readily, only too glad to take an active part in the investigation, and having by this time reached the end of Doughty Street, I took leave of Thorndyke and made my way back to Cornish's house.